Hey, it's Crumbs. You're lost? How do you not know where you are? It's Thorin's channel.
Right, this is going to be episode 17 of Watch the Overture. And as people know if they watch this show by now, like the way this show is distinctly different from Oversight is that Oversight is basically supposed to just follow the Overwatch League every week roughly, and then, you know, whatever guest you have on, you tailor which teams you talk about with them, and you talk about the big marquee games. You know, it's kind of like a weekly coverage show to me. Whereas what I made the concept with the Watch the Overture was, it was like Yiska and me have a topic we want to talk about, or a guest that would be perfect for a topic, and we try to marry the two together and hopefully get some interesting, sometimes like literally analytical content, sometimes I would say meta-analysis or side shoulder stuff, historical stuff, a lot of different angles to go with. So for this one, it's a rare example of where, I'll just say this at the beginning as a caveat. This is not a show that people can request to be on. If you are a random fuck out there who's like, oh, I love Overwatch, like, I don't care. Don't care. Go post it on Reddit. Like, you're never going to be on the show. But Peak has been on the show in the past, which is the important piece of detail here. And basically, at the moment, he's not with the team anymore. He's got all these ideas. He's been watching the Overwatch League, enjoying the stellar level of competition that GOATS has now ushered in to the Overwatch League. I mean, God forbid anyone who used to think it was boring when it was the dive meta, but, you know, it's certainly interesting now. So all I'm going to say is this, guys. If a Swedish person, I'm talking about a real Swedish person as well, actually says, like, I've got some interesting / spicy opinions, you better just, first of all, clear your whole schedule, get like a glass of wine, get the fire going, and just fucking bunker in for the night, because it's going to be good. So I'm already interested to see where this is going to go, because it's already so rare that people who are Swedish actually ever flame other people. But crucially, this is where I feel like Peak, it makes sense though still. Like, it sounds counterintuitive, but what I think makes sense is, you are a coach though. And coach's job pretty much is to politely flame people, you know, to tell them where they're doing stuff wrong, look at the obvious mismatches that they haven't, you know, capitalized upon, show where a game plan never made sense, etc. So we're going to try and do that with some of the Overwatch League teams that are currently in the league, and some of them are, in theory, are good teams, some of them are bad teams. So let's start out in your native Sweden. So if everyone remembers, the team that represented Sweden in Overwatch League Season 1 was obviously the Florida Mayhem. Now, they have cut everyone from the team except Tavik, who himself, you know, didn't have the greatest Season 1, but fair enough, he's a legacy player. People want to see him be a good player. And on the one hand, good news, they got a load of Koreans. On the other hand, they don't seem to have gotten the good Koreans, so there is a distinction to be made there. So what is it that jumps off the page for you, Peak, that is the problem with the Mayhem? Why does this team come to mind?
So with Mayhem, like when they rebuilt the whole team, I was expecting maybe even, you know, how to say, drop everything, every idea of like how to feel Twick around Twick, etc., and sort of play his strategies like game plans. And it's very similar how Florida played last season compared to how Misfits played, for example, or how Rogue played before the Frenchies went to Rogue. And now it basically looks like they look for every excuse to not practice GOATs, not play GOATs, and to have Twick on DPS, Sombra, when then you have BQB, you can play Sombra. But they found out that later. And they realize, okay, guys, doesn't work out, we got to make something happen, and they go on GOATs last minute, and they expect it to matter, or like to be impacting. It's sort of like they have all these plans that they have been overthinking about, like making sort of cute rotations, long rotations, take 2 minutes to rotate around the map, and then they end up losing a fight. They can go triple DPS, quad DPS, doesn't look pretty, then they go on GOATs, and they never specialize, they never choose anything. It's like trying to find a movie on Netflix when there's nothing good on. Like, you end up scrolling forever and forever and forever and going in loops. And especially yesterday, when they played against Chengdu, it was basically Chengdu basically dragged them down to quad DPS levels, and then they fought on equal equal, how to say, levels, I guess, yeah.
Standing or something, yeah.
Yeah,
Similar
equal
ground.
standing, yeah. And they were not in control of anything. Like, it's like getting baited. And they lose against Genji Reaper, for example. Like,
Yeah.
that has never happened before in pro matches, I think. No one has ever played Genji Reaper together. At least not in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. So, like, it's even worse than Fuel losing 2 points in 2 fights on King's Row when defending.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the weirdest part from the get-go was you have... I'm not sure if he's superstar level yet because that team didn't have any results, but Sire player, who you could easily build the team around, right? To an extent, I guess, by bringing more Koreans in, that happened. It wasn't very good Koreans. That we could have also told you before that was going to be the case. Then it is one thing. By the way, Sideshow put out, like, I think it was on his stream where he said, like, oh, I don't understand why bad teams always think they can reinvent the meta. I don't think even that is true. I think they are legitimately just lost. Like, if you're bad at GOATs, what is left to do? Lose at GOATs consistently? That is, by the way, one thing that people probably don't understand. If you play standard GOATs, again, into standard GOATs, the reliability of outcomes, so the probability of the better team winning fights, is at least as high as it was in Dive, in my estimation. So,
whereas, just so people understand the context here, because people who are observers and who don't play professional Overwatch League don't necessarily know the intricacies of what's happening in those fights, they naively often think, oh, it's just people spamming shit, and then the idea is like, oh, it's just chaos. Whoever wins, it's almost luck, isn't it? Whereas, I mean, as you're alluding to, it's really not luck. Like, you can really see the teams who know what the fuck they're doing, and they're winning pretty consistently.
Yeah, it's for instance, take the Widow meta. Like, almost the Widow players in Overwatch League, no matter how bad you are, you can get that lucky angle, or that you can sort of like take a different peak angle, get the lucky shot on the support, and suddenly you just win the fight because you took out trance or something. Stuff like this doesn't happen. You don't luck out as much in GOATs. I think if you think GOATs is random in outcome, you probably haven't understood clean GOATs as well. Now, of course, with a different approaches to GOATs, such as Sombra coming in and stuff, okay, there's way more variables where it is sort of gambly. Is the Zenyatta a little bit more around the corner? Does he get hit by that EMP? Like, it's not random by the nature of the word, but it's also not unreliable. It's very, like, GOATs versus GOATs in outcome. For instance, if you, like, previously in Europe, right, there were teams that were not losing maps to the third best team in Europe. Simply because if you're the better GOATs team, there are no avenues in clean GOATs where you could outplay an opponent by or luck out into a win percentage. So, long story short, there's no way that Florida could probably even play GOATs unless they really improve. What I will say, though, is I definitely agree with you in saying, why are you switching through strategies? Perhaps it's a little distant or a little unfair to say it that way, because I'm sure they probably should have some idea why they're switching where and when, because of map locations or whatever. Maybe there's some rationale behind it, but it does seem like they're trying out a lot. And if you're one of the perceived worst teams, and let's keep in mind, by the way, we're trashing Florida a little bit, even though they did win against Philly.
So I don't think we're trashing yet.
Okay, here we go. Yeah. I see what you mean, Thorin.
We're just diagnosing the illness first.
Yeah, this is the shallow layer.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind me interrupting there.
No, come on. Yeah.
So I think they can at least make an effort on GOATs, because half of the league doesn't know how to play GOATs. Half of the league has Reinhardts that are basically feeding. And for example, Spitfire and Gesture is a prime example. I have a clip on Twitch where he's basically, I posted it on Twitter and it went kind of viral, but he's basically rotating and spinning around, and you could put the like soundtrack of Flowrider Spin Me Around. It would be perfect. But Swan, for example, in Florida, he's positioned to hold aggro in some fights. Let's say that you win a fight and you want to hold aggro because if you hold enemy spawn and the cart is a bit far back, you respawn and you can contest the cart right as the enemies are arriving to the cart, basically. And they go for this push. The team behind him, they back off. Either he's muted, or well, they are muted, or he's not hearing, or maybe tunnel visioning, or who knows. But he ends up like getting picked off alone. For example, in the Atlanta game on Hollywood, when they defended, all you need to see is like, okay, there's a Reinhardt, he's alone, grab him, kill him, and that's it. And you just need to play around your Reinhardt. You can copy where Shock is holding their Reinhardt, basically, where they select the fights, or where Vancouver are selecting the fights. And you just place Swan there. He doesn't need to be mechanically gifted or anything, but he holds shield and he swings, and you just copy the same locations. Now, in order to make the super plays, that's when you need to be Bumper, for example, or Guju or something. But with Goats, like, you can win half of the matchups just by purely having the right positions and the right timings, like ult cycles, for example, so you don't stack support ults, or maybe you don't use Grav and then forget using Diva Bomb, for example. You can use Grav to beat out trans and stuff. Like, that simple stuff that you learned 3 years ago, back in 2016 or 15. And Tvik is the one that taught me some of it as well. Like, he's the one who taught me, like, which corners to hold on. And they're not holding the right corners even. So I'm not sure who's making the strats there, but they should just copy and try to execute it, like, decently at least.
Well, in line with what you're saying there, because I actually myself, since I've made so many videos, obviously my field's Counter-Strike over the years, one thing I decided years and years ago to try and be fair was, anytime I critique someone, it's like I can't critique you too harshly if even I don't know what you could do or what would be a potential solution. Because then it's like, you know, if I was in your situation, what would I do? Like, I can't tell you did the wrong thing if I have no clue what the right thing is. But I can point out you didn't do something great. So along those lines, like, you're suggesting here, like, the solution is they still have to embrace Goats. They still have to try and get to a higher level. Because I would actually say one aspect that might seem counterintuitive to people who are only casually watching Overwatch at the moment and maybe don't understand the meta, is every single meta in every game you ever follow will always have a counter. But the problem is, you look at the counters to Goats, and you could argue you might even need a better lineup of players than to play Goats to do the counter. Like, for example, if you're going to do triple DPS, well, good luck. You better have some fucking amazing DPS players to win this game. So a lot of the teams who can't play Goats in the first place probably don't have the personnel to do any of the counters. Like, at least not at a high level. Would you agree?
I agree. Like, how are you gonna beat Happy on Widow, for example, or how do you beat any proficient Sombra player, or like Violet, for example, if he happens to be on a Zen in a 2-2-2, or like Hammond one tank and then triple DPS? Like, you don't win those matchups unless you can frag out and play alone without getting pocketed with resources. In this case, like where I say to copy, like, at least make it foolproof for Swan to die by just adding all the heals onto him and force enemies into attacking into one direction. It's basically like playing chess almost. And you don't need to practice 10,000s of hours in scrims for this. You can purely do this with Stats Banana, like a tool to like place heroes on a map and like do fearing and stuff. You can learn this with VOD review, and like, they might as well take a contenders team and replace them. That's how how bad it is right now.
Yeah, I thought this about some teams. Like, I think I'm not even being unfair when I say Hurricane could have probably played better than London Spitfire.
I mean, they're at least a real team. They have played Goats already. We already know they can.
Yeah. So in general, okay. So the British Hurricane themselves weren't like some specialist Ghost team, because after they brought in Dennett, they mostly also played Doom Goats, right? But at the same time, yeah, I still think just having been in this meta for such a long time, knowing the ins and outs, also the basics. Like, I have people in Europe basically telling me, that it's sometimes insane to see which fundamentals are just not developed yet. At the same time, there are also people, let's say Christopher, for instance, who has played through that meta, who's telling me, okay, maybe it's not as terrible as we think it is. It's just that it is different. So, for instance, one example you mentioned is in Europe, what you would often see is like first, let's say it's a payload map, right? And you would start attacking into the card immediately upon map start, basically holding the first card point in order to then chop the way to the point to point A to 3 fights instead of 2, almost disregarding what the map layout looks like, right? And then now GOATS teams, or in Overwatch League teams, have realized, okay, this is probably not the right approach to play everywhere on those maps. Let's put the Zarya on high ground. She does more damage that way, builds grabs faster, and let's only do that, that chopping the way in 3 parts on some maps, right? So for instance, Root is still played that way. I will say, though, a team that doesn't do it as frequently is Paris, and they seem to have a way better understanding where to cut and where to not cut. And this, like, playing of, like, Spider-Man Zarya, I call it, is, like, way overused. I get it on Hollywood, second. I get it on Root, for instance, even though Root is pretty good for first point defenses there. But yeah, all the other stuff is just, it's mind-boggling that the divide is so big, and the answers to that problem seems to be so apparent that every contenders team seems to have internalized them to a higher degree.
Like, for example, Spider-Man Zarya, you mean like Zaryas who basically do whatever they want and walk like alone or wide angles?
Yes. Wide angles, high ground, also not supporting their Reinhardt with their personals. So, like, theoretically, you're just watching this for people who've, watched some. And I will also, like, one caveat I have to say is, of course, I have the GOATs in mind most of the time where the Brigade was still as it was, right? So this stuff would not work with the old Brigade change, because you would just jump on the Reinhardt, you would stun him through the shield, do whatever to him, burst him down before the Zarya could even drop in help with the personal. This is not happening, as much anymore, where you can burst down the Reinhardt and you can still bubble him in that way, right? So, yeah, I see that there's also one adaptation to be made because of the meta or the patch change that did fundamentally change GOATs a little bit.
I think it doesn't happen, that Reinhardts get bursted down as much, because there's, for example, the Fusion game, when Elk subbed in for Boombox, there's this like delay with Discord being applied, and you miss out on big chunks of damage, and you only have a split second basically to deal that damage during a Brig stun. And bubble is not even enough. Like, you can pop the bubble, it's only 200 HP, and you can do 800 damage. Now you have heals to deal with as well, and it's all about coordination and being very strict with executing it. And you got to be able to shift focus and attention, like, from one target to another one immediately. Now, for example, Shock in if we take Sinatra in World Cup, he was playing Spider-Man Zarya. Now in Shock, he doesn't. I don't think so. He's playing very tight around the corners, and for example, if he needs to disengage, he takes 3 steps instead of 5 steps, for example. And that's a big difference compared to if you're playing, let's say that you're playing against Florida, and they are standing in the middle of a street. Now, they might need 8 steps or 7 steps, who knows, but that's enough time to blow them up, or they are late to hide from a Diva bomb, or who knows what. And I think that's what the worst GOATS teams and OWL lack. And I think it's instead of playing like good positioning and everything, alongside with good ult tracking, ult cycling, and baiting out ults, countering ults, they emphasize more on the quick fix, basically winning fights by better ult cycles. And then if you take NYXL, they punish bad positioning. They rush a single target, whoever it is. If it's a Reinhardt, Break, Zarya, they rush them and kill them. Atlanta, they grab one person. If they see one person completely free, that's a free fight to win. And I think it's gonna increase. Like it's gonna increase the Ryan, for example, one-shot burst, even before the patch.
That's actually a very interesting concept, because I remember back in the day, like I analyzed like a clip of Pine on Ilios, I think it was. And basically what I saw was that he didn't only have amazing fundamentals, he had also something that I guess it's a little, wordy, but an adherence to micro objectives. So basically, or he didn't have that. So some players, they see a target, and yes, it might be a primary target, or it might just be really something that is in their crosshair right now, and they will stick to that target until it is dead. Way too long. Pine doesn't do that. Pine scans while having very solid fundamentals. I think he's so good at aiming, he doesn't really even have to think much about all the positioning stuff and like crosshair placement. That's just second nature to him. What he then thinks about is, what am I actually seeing next to my crosshair? Is there a priority target that I could get, or someone being out of position? Now, this on a team level is way harder to coordinate, but the fluidity of that, this ability of a team to do that in GOATs, that's also, by the way, completely unexplored in Overwatch League, I think, so far.
Yeah, that brings me to idea I didn't think of before the show, but with, for example, Shock, they have Krusty, and Krusty is very known for strict and I guess hands down coaching.
Yes.
Like it's sort of like he'll burn you on the fingertips, like if you don't do what you're supposed to do, because there's a set system. Now you can't achieve that strictness, that discipline, that tone basically in the team with anything else. Like you gotta be molding the team in order to, how to say, Krusty himself, he produced not him only him, but the staff. Their way of looking at the game produced Shock, and that's why they're so strict. Now, if you go for Mayhem, they have the Koreans there, but I think it's sort of like a weird culture where you're semi-strict, but you have the Western type of strict where it's going to be half-assed and it's going to feel weird. For example, if we take Chengdu, they have only DPS lineups, and that's the typical Chinese team playstyle, for example. Now, I think some coaching staffs are just way too soft, so to say. Like they're not soft in the way they coach. It's more like soft in the way that they accept whatever, from, accept whatever type of idea or strat from players, and then are afraid of politics, or maybe not knowing.
They're not demanding enough.
Yeah, they're not demanding enough. Like they don't demand something from the player. It's more like the player decide if the coach is going to stay or not. Yeah. But in reality, they don't actually. Okay. And if you want strong GOATs, you got to have some fire. Basically, Paris has, I think they have a great, the team. I don't know how it is in the team, but in general, French teams are very object-oriented. Like they focus on the objective. Basically, what's the steps to the goal, rather than the side steps. And if you derail or anything, you'll get flamed or whatever they do, and you'll get put in place, and then you go forward. I assume it's like that because when you watch them play, they're very strict in how they move, how they select targets, and how they follow up and focus fire, etc.
Okay, right. Being as, obviously, one of the main themes, even just in this discussion so far, has been how the Reinhardts are playing in all these teams. And if people watched Overwatch League Season 1, obviously it wasn't Reinhardt. Like, there was that hasn't been for many years now. Hence, I mean, you could obviously make the obvious joke, hence why Reinforcer's been on the desk for the last few years. But, it hasn't been something that people had to be very competent at. So, something you alluded to earlier, Peak, is it's one thing if the Mayhems of the world, or some of the other teams that are considered, like obviously the Justice is a great example. If these teams have flaws, that's understandable. understandable. They're not expected to be the best teams. But what's really telling to me is what you alluded to earlier, that the Spitfire has trouble with this, and particularly Gesture has trouble, because obviously if you were waiting until the start of this season, I think you'd find a lot of people who would say Gesture is the best tank player in the entire world in Overwatch League. So what is the disconnect here? Because clearly they have the roster to make these comps work, right?
They do. Now, like, I'm not sure how Gesture learned Winston, for example, or learned Orisa, because if he just grinded out hours, I'm not sure if he can pick up any hero and in a short amount of time and then basically master it. For example, you don't have, like Rascal, for example. Rascal can pick up anything and become good at it. Seagull can, for example. Then, anyways, back to Gesture. I think he doesn't know the fundamental positioning for Reinhardt. He doesn't know, for example, when to cut corners, or when to hold corners, when to, for example, use charge to escape. And because he's so inexperienced on Reinhardt, he doesn't chop up the planning, so to say. Like, he doesn't do planning as early as possible. So it's like trying to shove in a ton of information in the head, and then you just end up making the decision, making the decision that just comes first in the order. And sometimes it's just standing still in one location, holding shield and spinning around. And I think, like, if you give him a steering wheel, for example, and tell him to play like Need for Speed, for example, and get to point A, from point A to point B, he would do a better job than playing with a keyboard, just because I think the muscle memory from Winston probably sits in. He probably doesn't have the same, how to say, he expects he can jump maybe, but he knows he can't jump on Reinhardt, etc. And if they fix that, then they can play Goats well. However, I don't think he will fix it, because I don't know. I don't think he can fix it. It's too late to try and work on it. It's basically Shanghai from season 1.
Yeah,
in terms of his Reinhardt.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like a software issue, right? Like, their hardware is obviously very good, right? So they would have the fundamental ideas, but the problem is this is not like an enlightenment meta where you have like the geniuses that make the difference, and this is like deep communism, dude. Like, if you don't know the cues and stuff, like, you might have the KGB in front of your door, like, going like, this doesn't work, dude. So,
well, this is like if we take I'll give the analogy. Okay, so if you ever watch a movie that's set in the medieval period, obviously whoever the hero is, he's winning every sword fight. He's fighting 3 people at once. It's basically him and whoever the enemy hero is. They're going to meet at some point in the battle, because they're just the ones that are deciding the battle. Whereas you go to like 20th century and it's like infantry wars, where if you're just a member of the infantry, your job is like move forwards in the direction they told you, and you're going to win based on like more meta concepts than what you individually do. It's like, was the entire team in the right place? Was the coordination in the right time? Did you hit the right timing on the opponent? It's like, actually, as an individual, you kind of have to just do your job and hope that the overall picture makes sense, because you're not making all these crazy, like you say, genius plays that'll decide the whole game. You can't really do it.
Yeah, you can do it, but it's, how to say, Fisher, for example, in Seoul, he does it. But then you have Vancouver, who has extremely strong goats. Bumper doesn't make all the genius plays there.
No, he doesn't need to,
Yeah. I think if you take the role of the genius in the team, you're going to have to, like, you might as well do something greater for the world than playing Overwatch in that.
The problem really is that the level of genius works differently now. It is not mechanics. It is not necessarily like individual routing or like, outthinking the opponent. It really works in comms, most definitely. So, for instance, what a lot of European coaches tell me is if you have a competent Reinhardt in the GOATS meta that is also vocal, that can basically tell their team when to breathe, this is very valuable. So, for instance, someone like Fusions comes to mind, right? Who can coordinate the push and pull, who has an idea about the enemy cooldowns, about the enemy ultimates. You can hard carry, but by different metrics. And sadly, these metrics are also fairly invisible to the fan, which makes it then less appealing, right? It's not like the genius of like a Carpe that just, in one Widow pull takes 2 support heads off. That's not how it works in GOATs.
Okay. So another one peak that you wanted to reference was the play of Janus, who people might remember vaguely from the NYXL last year. Obviously didn't get that much playing time. He's obviously now playing for the Washington Justice. What was it about his Reinhardt that sprung to mind?
Now, his Reinhardt I think it's good. It's good because he has been playing Reinhardt ever since Apex, basically. Now, it's not insane or anything. It's more like he knows how to stay alive and all. But in OWL Season 2 here, or 2019 OWL, all he does is press pin. He goes for the pins. He goes for charges, and it's basically like fighting jets, diving, to the ground basically, and taking people with them. And I think it's really bad. It's bad practice because any Reinhardt, when they watch him, they would get this like anxiety in the gut, basically feeling you shouldn't pin here. This is really bad. And he gets bubbles. Of course, he gets bubbles, but you're betting everything on gambling, basically.
Yeah.
And they haven't done well so far. And what do you do, for example, when teams figure out that you gamble all the time? Yeah. You're going to end up with a dumpster fire.
It is especially unfortunate because okay, let's be fair. They probably, this stage, at least how we perceived it before the season, now I might have to revise that, but they look to have one of the hardest stage 1 matchups, possibly in the entire league, right? They had a lot of A-level teams that they went up against. At the same time...
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I was going to say, I don't think NYXL is A-level, but sure, against them, it's A-level since they punish bad mistakes and all.
Yeah. The problem is, like, I don't think you could have crafted a better meta situation for them in order to do well. Because this, by all means, is a coaching meta. This is where star-level coaches who have a really solid grasp on GOATs and who also, like, I even think data really lends itself to GOATs in a sense, because you can find these adaptations through the numbers possibly of like, okay, so how does bubble timings work out here? At what point? For one thing that's, for instance, interesting is that European teams found out it is actually not that good to bubble the Rhine immediately upon taking damage. Let him drop a little bit so your healers can pick him up, and then it increases the time. If you can statistically find the sweet spot where you want to do that, and also take how much charge is going in and everything like that into account, I think there are a lot of adaptations, but you need the fundamentals. And I thought Washington might even come out this in stage 1 and surprise us with a good GOATs, because they had been scrimming for a while. They have supposedly, these star level coaches. So the fact that they are not winning now, that is a bad sign for me, especially because it also seems to be that this team was very much built around Janus. This is a Janus meta, and still nothing much countable is happening other than, okay, having close series here and there. But yeah, I even thought, like, if I had done power rankings, Washington Justice wouldn't have been the last team, I think.
That, I think that, the star level coaching meta, or coaching meta, I mean, ties into the Valiant also. I wanted to quickly talk about Valiant, where if you, for example, in the latest Valiant video, they talked about how they practice with Custa, and they realized, okay, Custa's GOAT's understanding is higher than the team, so they sub him out in order to have, with the goal of having stronger teamwork with more basic GOATs. And obviously it didn't work out. Backlash comes, he gets subbed in for KOF only. He wins KOF, but they lose all other maps. And now it's double-sided on many levels, or like many points, but first of all, if you, as the coaching staff, understand what the difference in GOATs is from his understanding to the team's understanding, you should be able to teach it as well, because if you understand something, you should be able to teach it. Otherwise, you don't understand it.
Yes.
And that's telling me that A, they either don't want to play with Custa, or B, they don't know how to teach it, or C, it's both. It could be both as well. There's scrims that are being lost because some timings are not quick enough, some timings are missed, maybe someone tunnel visions or forgets, etc. And it was the coach's decision, according to public information.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's better to face the facts and learn how to play the better goats, rather than staying with basic goats and then losing matchups anyways, and then resorting to the cust option.
Wait a minute, just so I'm clear what you're saying there. Like, even if someone isn't that good at the very simple goats, as opposed to just keep trying to refine that, actually just try and go all out trying to do the more advanced version.
Not the advanced version. I try to take the idea from Custa and try to teach the rest of the team what Custa knows, because clearly there's some difference in understanding how to play the game. The fact that they sub in Custa tells me that they are completely fine with ruining the 4 weeks of practice that they had with Cookie in order to just win Koff or push up the PR, basically, so the fans are not mad. And this is a prime example of how you ruin cores. Like, they're not going to build up a core around Cookie or around Custa. And the Lucio player is the least subbed out player, I think, in this meta so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also the Lucio as well as the main tank, I think, is usually a bad idea. It's also, what I wonder really is okay, so in my mind, stage 1 was always going to be chaotic, right? We have a new meta, we have new teams, we have bans still in place, we have some players that aren't of age. So some of those teams also seem to be trialing a lot. For instance, almost like stage match trialing. Okay, who can bring it on the big stage?
Sure.
So San Francisco Shock comes to mind, switching between Smurf and Super, who, by all rights, maybe you would have given Smurf a little bit of an edge before the season, but now they're trying out, okay, what's actually the deal here, right? So I wonder if much of what we're seeing here is really just saying, well, we don't really care that much about stage 1. Let's try to get a core in place that will serve us in future metas, because we can count on Blizzard to nerf goats to the point where it doesn't work anymore. Let's disregard that this didn't work for the last half year, right? Like, where they already tried to get rid of goats. But let's trust that next meta, it's all going to be different, and then we want to have a different core experience. Let's not maximize win chances here. For instance, Philly is probably, I think, also doing the very same, because in a Rhine meta, yes, Sato is not bad, but Fraggy is a top performer on that pick, right? Mm-hmm. So I also think just because, like, this guy has had it with his milk to play triple tank metas, right? So, like, why are you going to play him? My only answer to this is either you have a core in place that doesn't want to play with Fraggy anymore, or it is a long-term decision in order to build the core up where the stage 1 situation is still volatile. You still can get some wins that you shouldn't be getting while building up for future stages, and then cash in on in the back or in the later half of the season.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to Valiant, I don't think they will be able to build a core until they select, like, okay, this is the group we're going to focus on. Because when they keep switching in and out, it's like it takes weeks, at least a month to build a core, form a core. And that's one stage. Like, if you switch to custom more now, basically all the practice you did with Cookie is going to be counterintuitive. It's going to be, you have different voices, different accents, different tones, different calls, positions, ways of thinking, problem solving. Everything is different. And it might not be noticeable, but it's like not like spreading like an infection, but it's like spreading throughout the team eventually. and Kasta's touch is going to be resulting in some form of Valiant, while Cookie's touch is going to result in some other form.
Yes.
And whatever, like if the coaches don't believe in Kasta, but put him in anyways because of the fans or whatever internally, that puts a specific tone as well to the team. Like that affects how the team is. Like you don't get the same team as if you believe in Kasta and put him in because you believe in him.
Sure. I mean, it seems to me that half the problem here, to align with what Yiska said, is like if I just tried to think as an outsider what I speculate people did in season 1 of Overwatch League, like I think they came into Overwatch League season 1 and really just thought it was like a normal competition. You know, you put in the team that you think's been doing well in practice, you play the game, you try and win the game. Right now, what do we do next week? But if you look at the way it went with all the stages, and if you actually look at the stages, basically it wasn't even about who had the best teams. It was generally about who had the best read on the meta and who was the best at executing it. So actually, if the lesson, if anything, from season 1 wasn't like just put your best players in, it was like just try and get the lineup that works the best at this current meta, because it was very, very like, I won't say like limiting, but it was quite well defined as to what was going to make you win in these metas. Well, the problem obviously in season 2 is if you try to take that same approach, then either you're going to have to go hard into GOATs now and just put in the lineup that works, or in this case, it sounds like Valiant, for whatever reason, in the long term, actually is sort of favouring Cookie over Costa. And so they're saying, right, well, since one day we want it to be a Cookie lineup anyway, doesn't matter if the Costa lineup wins in the short term or would be better for now. Like our long-term goal is whatever, be the best in the next stage with, you know, Cookie and be the best team in the league or something. So like, it's definitely a completely different philosophy. And I don't really know that yet, like based on what I said about Overwatch League season 1, that's necessarily the right one, because for a start off, unless you do get to a good enough level in GOATs, you're surely always going to have this problem with the Cookie call. Like, you're basically just hoping Blizzard changes the game for you. And in that case, why not have just been practicing with the other lineup?
Not only that, you also have Kariv switching to DPS. And I guess that's to have Kariv in, but still get the benefit of having the better Zen, I guess. And
sure.
I think it's a bit too short-sighted, or like wanting too much of too many things. Like gotta decide what's the most important, having Kariv in and feeling good about it, or getting the win.
Like one thing we have to say is it should be very scary to established Overwatch League teams that new teams are currently splitting against them. There are rookies in this league, or teams made up of rookies, that are literally at halftime puking because of stage fright of the situation, and they're winning games against you. Yeah. How is that going to go when the league, you know, when these guys get experience, and actually that, like, many of them aren't even playing in their perfect meta at the moment, sure. Right? For instance, someone like Guangzhou, as soon as a Widowmaker pops up, these guys are dominating. Happy will kill your Widowmaker. I don't care if you're Zarya player. You're not winning that. So I'm not sure if established Overwatch League teams, other than possibly NYXL, I guess, even though they're not doing, I mean, they're not doing terribly. Of course, they're 3-0, but like other than
it's questionable what the impact of experience is, put it that way, right?
Yeah, because that was one of the big questions I had before the league started. How big is experience bringing in these players, and like how important will veterans be, right? And as of right now, that's about even. It doesn't look like it matters much.
Isn't it like this then? In a formula where the variable experience has a ton of value, then it matters. But when you're competing for the strongest player on a position, or hero, for example, the strongest Zen who can frag the most, then being the best at mechanics has more value. So you might as well put in a rookie, and then experience doesn't really matter. Sure. I don't think. Yeah, then I think. How do you say? You're making a mistake by going for that type of formula, and instead go for something that makes it valuable for your experience. Like how you can take value from your experience. For example, team synergy. Like Fusion has, like you can clearly see that Fusion plays way worse without Boombox compared to with Boombox, because there's timings that are completely off. And if you then go for season 1 and look, people stop switching out players because all that matters is knowing what's supposed to be done and being able to carry it out, like you said before.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still early to talk about this, right? But if you just look at the current standings, there are only 3 former Overwatch League teams from Season 1 in the top 8. Like, it is actually comical if you just read from the bottom up. Okay, there's Washington Justice, then Valiant, then Shanghai, Florida, London, Los Angeles Gladiators, Boston, Houston. That's like till place 13, right? Of course, like, probably this would change if you gave it a close look to the schedules and everything. And yes, it's a 2 or 3 game sample size, but it's still like the early impression that those teams have left is really not as impressive. And also, like, we also have to then start looking at errors in this system, because if every or many of these old teams start underperforming, I refuse to believe that this is something that is just, randomized in that regard. I think it's just a culmination of too long off season, too little adaptation required by Overwatch League teams. The old Overwatch League teams underestimating how good the new teams would be. I thought, for instance, like, I think it was even on Oversight where Brad said one thing he underestimated in stage 1 was what it would take to be very good in the Overwatch League. He thought his roster was going to be very good. How have you not learned at this point? Brad seems to have learned. I'm not sure if the others have had the same experience, because some of these teams, I'm looking, for instance, at Houston Outlaws, who, that's a weird case, but still, one player, just one upgrade on one position. Maybe there's something with Infinite going on in terms of like changing. Even London only getting 2 players. Like, that wasn't a dominant season by any means. Sure. You won the playoffs.
Wouldn't you say it's too little adaptation enforced? Like from the teams. I don't think the league needs more, because the rookie teams are automatically gonna come in with like at least equal or higher level of force, or like trying to be competitive compared to all teams. It's like getting used to the like a level, and then forgetting how to like push past it or like break plateaus.
Yeah,
sure. Like Shock is a good example. Krusty, he demands, for example, okay, we're gonna execute goats perfectly, and if we don't do it, then we're gonna keep working on it. Now, you could also be Chengdu and try to make your own meta. Like, you can still put a ton of demands on the team then as well, but might be more difficult to see results.
I'll give you an analogy. So in the beginning of CSGO, people might know a famous narrative, which was that the best team in the beginning of CSGO was Ninjas in Pajamas, and they won the first 87 maps that they played on LAN. So they were like unbelievably dominant. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people to this day don't know a key piece of context, which is as to how they were 87-0, which is that some of the best teams in Counter-Strike at the time didn't swap over to CSGO immediately. They actually kept playing out CS 1.6 for a few months into when NiP was starting in CSGO. So immediately, some of the best talent wasn't there in CSGO. And then here's the key point. When some of those teams came over to CSGO, because they didn't have any ramp-up time, like the game was already underway, and they were already had some of the best teams from CS 1.6, and they basically just took that same team, put it into CSGO, and in their brain thought, well, it's Counter-Strike, whatever, we'll figure it out. And what happened was, both of the big teams who did it, so there was the Na'Vi team from CIS region, and there was the Polish team, which I think, I forget what they were called, I think ESC or something they were called at the time. And both of these teams basically took the mentality of like, right, we're going to make these lineups work. And so the flaw was they had like a solid between 3 and 6 month span each, where they were never quite as good as they thought they were going to be. And they kept bashing their heads against the wall of hoping all their 5 players would be good in a completely different game, basically. Whereas if you can see the problem here, is they'd already come in with the limitation that like these 5 players have to be good in this game that we actually can't know yet that they're going to be good at. Whereas if they'd have even just taken like the few that were really good immediately and had aptitude, and even picked up some people who'd never played CS before at the top level, but they were good right now, like they show some promise, they probably would have gotten to a higher level way quicker, and even in the short term they would have been viable. So one of the factors that I would say in this respect is, like you're saying here, Peak, it does feel like some of the lineups, people are just determined that they're going to make certain players who they want in their lineup and to be a key aspect. They're going to make this guy work in GOATs no matter what. So like the Kareev example is a good one, because I know there are some teams, it's got to be the same with Gesture. Like if you're the coach of London Spitfire, it's going to be so hard to break the paradigm that you have to have Gesture in the team. How could you not? Like even if he's not good now, he's surely going to be the future of the team. So it's going to be tough to change people's minds. Whereas, as you're saying, a team that comes in fresh now, well, first of all, they've recruited people who in theory are good right now at Overwatch. And secondly, they have no basis from the past. They don't have to have one guy in the team. If he's bad now, they put in another player. So some of these teams, if you look now, you would cynically say some of them who were even amazing teams should have signed almost like specialists just to round out the roster, just to have the option early on to make a makeshift team that would work.
I will also say, your analogy actually fits very well, you know, the transition between 1.6 and CSGO, because I think I could probably argue that GOATS is more different to Dive Overwatch than 1.6 was to CSGO.
Oh, almost certainly, because at least the fundamental concepts are similar. Like, obviously, it was mainly just mechanical aspects, you know, like maybe this player just wasn't as good at aiming with the new spray pattern or something, you know. I would agree, the fundamental meta was probably more similar, Yiska.
Yeah.
Whereas that's half the problem, as we've been alluded to earlier on when we were talking about how you know, it's very easy from the outside to think it's actually just a meta where no one knows what they're doing. Whereas actually, I mean, a lot of people clearly don't have a great grasp on it, but you can see the people who really know what they're doing, and they're winning almost all the time.
Yeah. What a crazy state of affairs, right? Where like the game changes so much on you in the off season that you have former MVP candidates you can't be sure of will be even average players.
That even feels like the trap though, doesn't it? Because the other thing is, I think there's some GMs who are like, oh, GOATs, brilliant, now I can use all my good tank players. It's like, that's not quite how it works, mate. Like, they have to actually fit the role. Like, you know, like you say with Kareev, it's like, the aim here isn't to get everyone in the group picture. It's like, we have to have a team that works.
Yeah. I mean, take Outlaws, for instance. They have a guy on the roster in Spree that all he does, or was hired for, was playing Zarya. This guy's not playing, other than on some maps, because it's now a DPS role, and it somehow like doesn't like why. So sometimes you will need to switch off the Zarya, maybe, even though I don't see it as much. Why is he not playing at the moment? Well, maybe it's a long-term thing. Maybe it's a synergy thing now. Maybe his style doesn't even fit the current Zarya because it's so much about bubble timing, so little about right clicks. Maybe it doesn't have, like, maybe you need more than a hero specialist. Maybe you need a hero style specialist. You need someone that is good at cooldown timing, and that makes your specialist for that very hero useless. So now, knowing this, how do you even build a team? Right?
Sure.
So it's a crazy state of affairs at the moment.
I think they learn Outlaws because they played Spree versus Spark and they completely dominated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When it came to non-cough maps.
Yeah, but why not? Like it baffles me that they didn't consider this starting the season. This is the player that you should, you know, start ever. Like if Spree's not starting now, when will he ever start? When is that ever going to happen?
Maybe he was accepting the role or like the position of not starting, and the team also not maybe seeing that he should be considered starting, or maybe, you know, who knows what it can be, but sometimes it can be like locked into your own box, basically.
Sure, but then again, it seems like this cognitive bias that is in place there should be easy to overcome when you see, oh, this is a Zarya meta. I hired someone for Zarya. Maybe play the Zarya player. Like, sure, there's something more to consider, and it's a simplification of the situation. But then again, I also hope that they invest more into that. But also, what does that mean for the long term for the Outlaws?
Maybe they are easily impressionable by the meta in the league overall. Like, for example, you don't have like confidence in, you know, your way of looking at the lineup, for example. Maybe there is confidence, but for example, I don't know who started putting the DPS players on Zarya. Could be Shock, for example, with Sinatra. now happens in not as good on Zarya, but if that spreads, like that becomes the common trend in the league, a team might not be confident in putting their Zarya on Zarya because they don't want to be accused of like being bots or something in game.
Yeah, sure.
Right, what about then? So a team we haven't really touched on is the Dallas Fuel. And obviously, they're very different teams to Season 1. So what is it about Fuel then that comes out in this topic?
I think the first match versus Shock, they completely lost because of not knowing where to fight, when to fight. Like, prime example, they were defending on King's Row, lost first point, lost second point in 2 fights. Like, never happens. And they lost second point in 1 fight because they just kept holding S, backpedaling, and just dying one by one, and getting snowballed, shoved back. And that's purely a team issue. That's not one person. That's team issue. And then they come back with a win versus Seoul. I think Seoul misplayed completely. They were overthinking of comps. Then when they faced Fusion, it was a different Fuel compared to week 1, where they had it's like they could do an exam, re-exam basically, and they planned one plan and everyone goes for that plan and they execute it. Sort of like how Paris is sometimes. They bubble early, they just focus tanks and that's it. They did well because Fusion, they couldn't handle it. Saudo was basically a shield bot. And they won simply because everyone was on the same page, and that's really important. I like that change because Fuel in the first match versus Shock, it was more like, okay, we're gonna hide and we're gonna scream in comms, okay, go out and kill, or like the plan is to kill someone. Like that's what it felt like, and bad positioning in general. So I think now it's fine, with Fuel, but if they face a team that can see through it, like the pattern, or like see how they play, they can figure out how they will. They can figure out what amount of changes they can make from week 1 to week 2, for example, between 2 matches or 1 match, and they can sort of make a forecast of what Fuel can be or can't be, and then get outplayed.
One thing I was interested in to ask you was, so Dallas Fuel, of course, have currently 2 Zarya players playing, and they're sort of sharing time. And honestly, AKM looks so much better in GOATS currently than Effect does. Now, on paper, also, this makes a lot of sense, because if we think of Effect, even as a Tracer player, this guy was on an island doing his own thing for a lot of his career. That is the anti-GOATS theorem, so to speak, right? So that he now doesn't work in that meta makes sense to me, and that's why it's hard for me to argue with that. But why would you? Do you think there's value in even playing him at the moment?
I don't think so. It would be for the firepower. That's the only reason. The only reason is firepower. I think AKM is they have different mindsets, where AKM has, ever since he played in Rogue, like he has had this mindset, every Rogue player had it, where they focus on the card, they focus on the point, like they play in like very rigid way. And they focus about the teamwork and not really about the flashy stuff. And AKM still does it. He still does it on Zarya. You give him a list of tasks and he sees value in them, then he carries them out. Like, that's the most important thing to him. With Effect, it might not be the same. And I think it's better for them to just field AKM and keep how to say, you want to keep it as similar as possible, because you don't need to do a Valiant, for example, and put one person on a special map, because GOATS doesn't differ on KOF as it does on 2CP or payload in such a big way that Dive does, for example, where you have Tracer going solo sometimes, and then you have Winston Tracer together, or maybe you have Winston Genji Tracer together. And for example, Diva, peeling, etc. Like, there's more complicated solo tasks in Dive compared to GOATS. And I think the most important part is keeping keeping the same lineup so that you can narrow down the timing or like the reaction time as much as possible.
Sure. This actually reminds me of another area where, because I always try in my mind when I'm looking at problems in the game to contrast like different sports and different esports games. Because like one thing I generally do in life anyway is if there's a problem, I try to like think from the perspective of the person who has the problem and not assume they're an idiot. Assume that, you know, they're trying to make the correct decisions and whatever they've chosen really was what they weighed up and it made the most sense to them. Like that philosophically is what they thought they should do. And so one of the things I've always thought, because like, whenever I see a meta like this, which is very, very messy for a lot of the teams, that means basically that, to tie into earlier, I don't look at the players and think these players are all idiots. I think that means a lot of the coaching staff does, as you said, they might themselves in their own brain think they know GOATs, but they can't explain it to someone. And if they can't explain it to someone and a competent player can't pick it up, that's actually the bigger disconnect than the player making the mistake. Because I'll give you the analogy is, in League of Legends, even though the game has been like at a top professional level for like literally, we're talking like 6 or 7 years now, some ridiculous amount of time, to this day, you will get many teams who are some of the best in their region who make complete macro misplays. Like they don't make the correct objective call, or when they do something, they don't seem to quite understand why they're doing it, and so they fuck up the execution. And again, to a pleb fan, they just go like, haha, look at these idiots, they don't know what they're doing. But it's like one of the reasons I always said in League why it makes a lot of sense that that's an issue is because there's no such thing as a timeout in a League of Legends game. Because obviously, like for start off, you know, the coach would have all the info of where everyone is on the map and stuff, you know, so you can't have timeouts. So what you're trusting when you coach a League of Legends team is, like, in theory, you can't even do the very, very simple systems-based approach of like, right, I'll tell you the flow chart. When you're at point A, you do these 3 options. If they do action X, then you do, you know, one of these 3 options. Like, if you could do that, like an NFL coach could, like, here's the 2 players that I want you to run, right? Pick whichever makes sense. That's a lot easier to manage as a coach. Whereas in this scenario, you're basically just hoping that you've taught the player why he does things, and then he's going to have to make all these decisions from a decision tree that you can't give him because it doesn't exist yet. He doesn't know what's going to happen in this game, and situations are even going to happen in the game that, you know, variants happen in practice, but this exact one has never happened before. No one's ever seen that exact scenario. And so I see it similarly with the GOAT scenario, because half the problem is once these big fights start, it's not just a simple flow chart. Like, there are so many decisions. And as we said, the key difference for me is it's different, like you're saying, if it's like set up like Dive, where it's like each person has his little task. And if he's doing very clever moves, he can even do them on his own and they work. From what I can see, the teams that win out in this scenario are the ones where most of them know what they're doing next. They know what the switch is here. They know what the adaptation is or the counter. The ones who have good players, but they're all doing different things, they're just terrible at the moment.
Yeah. It's like you have to teach players how to think for themselves, but also you don't teach them what to think. It's more like players already have the information. A player will always know more than a coach, and any coach that thinks they will know more than a player's kind of mind, so to say. Now you teach them how to filter information, how to pick out, for example, thinking about GOATs. You need a special archetype, now tanks in this case. And as a player, when you're in a grab, for example, you gotta, without doing it consciously, you gotta pick out, okay, this is what helps in a grab, and how do you stop like a diva bomb? You use bubble, you block with shields, etc. And if you don't know if you don't know how to filter the right information, it's sort of like gambling, like gesture on Reinhardt. You just hope that you get the right decision at the, you drag out the time as long as possible, and then maybe you get the right decision, maybe you don't. And in many cases you don't get the right decision because the other teams are gonna actively working on trying to make the right decision as well, and then punish you.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like my teaching job, where it's like you, for instance, in math tests, right? Like they're the kids that you give them just like the actual equation and they can solve it. They see the equation, they understand what to do. Now, if you give them text, exam questions, now they're lost. They don't understand which concepts to apply, which equation to apply, and it requires very different teaching. It's actually fairly easy, almost in 1.5 to 3 hours, to get someone to that level where they can solve the equations, for example, right? So but in order to explain to them why they're doing what they're doing in these specific things, and to contextualize and put that into language, also to communicate it to someone else, that is a different art form of coaching that possibly was less required up until this point in the meta.
Yeah, and now there's more, like, even complicated stuff there. Like, you have to think about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. If you're Florida Mayhem versus Chengdu and you're Swan and you do a flank pin or flank shatter that you normally would get punished by because you're not at the level where you have the game sense to do it in OWL, I mean. You get a kill, you get a big shatter because the enemies are so bad they don't check the angles. And now that's a confirmation. Okay, this is good. I can do this. That's, stuff you have as a coach you have to counter as well. You have to explain why it worked and why, it's not good to always do it.
This video and all of the content on my channel is kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, James Harding, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Travis Greb, Tristan Jones, and as always, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to take part in an esports discussion with yours truly? Would you like teasers for some of my upcoming content? See who the guests are going to be? Do you want to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA? Perhaps you'd like to suggest a guest you'd like to see in my content or a topic to discuss. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.